Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Now that the kids are back in class, or put COVID in a rearview mirror, at least for most people. Returning to this discussion that we were having pre-COVID about the use of cell phones in K through 12 school settings. And the consensus was, I think, fairly stated that it was unhelpful, that it too distracting and reduces attention spans and so on and so forth. But what does the actual science suggest as researchers are continuing to look into the impact of cell phones in classroom settings? Chris Ferguson is a professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida. We've had him on before. He and a colleague did an interesting meta-study a couple years back, maybe just last year actually, on racial bias in criminal sentences, and found, looking at some 4 dozen studies, really no evidence, despite the histrionics from the identitarians, of anything systemic in terms of racial discrimination in criminal sentencing. That made some news. Anyway, he's also the author of Catastrophe, The Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Decisions Worse. He joins us now. Professor Ferguson, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this morning.
So this study out of the UK on cell phone use in schools, give us sort of the summary of what the researchers did and why you are, I think you're a bit skeptical of the methodology.
Well, there are some pros and cons about it. So what they basically did is they looked at 30 different schools, 20 of which had restricted students' access to their cell phones in some manner or another, and 10 which did not. And what they basically found is that the schools that restricted students' access to their phones, that they didn't see any improvement in the youth mental health or their grades or how disruptive in the class. So, sort of taking that at face value, this added a little piece of evidence that, maybe these cell phone bans that have become very popular don't seem to be having the impact that people thought that they would, at least if the intention is to help kids in some sort of way. It doesn't look like these cell phone bans are helping kids. It doesn't look like they're necessarily hurting kids either, but it doesn't appear that they're helping kids, at least from this analysis.
How long were the restrictive policies imposed? I mean, maybe I missed it, but part of this, I wonder, was it long enough to suggest, that you could actually measure changes in academic performance?
Yeah, I think it was. It was over the course of, and I think it varied a little bit by the individual school, but it looked like it was about over the course of about a couple years. Okay. Yeah, in essence, that they had done this. So it's enough time that we would think that we would see a change. And it's important to point out, when you hear schools talk about these policies, they oftentimes claim, very early on, that they're seeing, drastic changes in their students' behavior. Within months in some cases. So it doesn't appear that the evidence is supporting those types of claims that schools are making. And even in some cases, with my local school here, for instance, I got a public information request, so I see some of the data that they've got. It's kind of the same thing that, from the year before the local schools here banned cell phones to the year that they actually did the ban of cell phones, there doesn't seem to be any improvements, in grades, in bullying behavior, in mental health referrals, or things like that. So we seem to be getting, not perfect data by any means, but different pools of data suggesting that maybe these cell phone bans are not having a clear positive influence, at least within a year or two of them being implemented.
Well, don't tell our governor that, because we're about to become the 9th state to ban cell phones in classrooms. But what I want to ask you, in regards of cheating, though, I just because I have 2 teenage boys, actually they're not teenagers anymore. Oh my God, but they. I mean, I know what some of them and their friends were doing. They had their cell phones, and they could, pre-write down answers in quizzes and tests.
Yeah.
And cheat. So in regards to cheating, you didn't notice any difference?
I don't know that these studies have tracked cheating specifically. There's nothing in the data that specifically looks at that. The relevant numbers they have are for grades. So we don't see that there are any grade differences between these schools. I think that's an interesting question. And it certainly is possible. Obviously, with the cell phones and smartphones, you could put the answers in. Theoretically, teachers could monitor the kids to make sure they don't have their cell phones out while they're taking a test.
Well, that's
in the same way, that they would do that with like written notes, which is to say imperfect.
No, but that's where I was going to go. I mean, one of the things, and I think you make this point in the study too, is distinguishing between the gradations in cell phone policy. I mean, some could be an outright ban; you can't have them on the school premises. Yeah. Others could be you could do it in homeroom or recess, if you call it, or whatever. Yeah. There could be intermittently during the day, and whether or not gradations in policy made any difference.
Yeah, the study actually did look at that. They actually did look at a number of schools, which were a relatively small number, to be fair, but a number of schools that had the maximalist policy, which means that the kids, if they had a phone with them, had to put it in a locked bag. Essentially, they could not access at any point during the day. And even those schools did not show an improvement over the more permissive schools. So, at least in that sense, it didn't appear that the restrictiveness of the policy made any difference. Now, I mean, of course, the thing you could say is, well, maybe the kids are, finding ways around the policy, and I think that's absolutely possible, or even probable that is happening. But it still kind of calls into question whether these policies are actually, one way or another. It doesn't look like these policies are doing the sorts of things we would hope that they were doing. And they sometimes do have some risk in the sense of, if students are caught, what is the punishment? And at least in some schools, again, like my local school here, they are using suspensions, at least in some cases, and suspensions are associated with negative outcomes for kids, including, reduced grades, but also including adult arrest and things like that. So there is some risk that if the schools are going a little overboard, at least with the punishment, at least in terms of suspensions, that those policies may actually harm some kids rather than help them.
What about the composition of the various schools in terms of the distribution of student performance going in? In other words, I mean, for example, here in suburban Chicago, there's a private school, Northridge Prep, which is a really good school. It's all boys school, and they have a no cell phone policy. But I mean, but all those kids get into Northridge Prep and going there, I mean, they're academic killers to begin with. So cell phone policy, no cell phone policy probably wouldn't register just because of the culture there. The school's culture matters too, and the distribution of performance among the student body. And I just wonder if maybe lower performing students with lower performing student bodies overall, there may be more of a delta just because it deals with that attention deficit.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think with this English study, it was a study conducted in the UK. It was with a range of schools, so that should smooth over some of those, demographic issues. I can say with the public information request I made at the local schools here, that's Orange County schools, such as Orlando, Florida, basically. That the public school district there has, if anything, an overrepresentation of ethnic minority, poor students and such. And so we're still not seeing that kind of positive change within a large public school that is not the private school, right? It's not the elite private school that is catering to a relatively wide range of kids, including probably a plethora of underprivileged kids.
Interesting. Well, I mean, But I just go back to those NAEP scores that came out a couple of weeks ago, too. I mean, there's so many variables in this that when the reading and math scores are so dismally low that, that the idea that this is some sort of panacea that's going to create a market change, I mean, it's probably there's good reasons to be skeptical of that just rationally.
Exactly, yeah. And I think a lot of what motivates this, I mean, what's interesting to me, too, is the sort of difference between, like, what teachers are saying. They're saying oftentimes that this is wonderful, this is great, and then here we have this data that suggests that, in fact, we don't seem to be seeing, much of any positive change in this. And I think that, it brings up this question of, well, why are the teachers and the administrators seeming to be seeing such a positive outcome from these? And I don't think they're lying, obviously. But I think one of the things that maybe is really the underlying motivation here is if you see a student on their cell phone as a teacher, and I'm a university professor, so I see this too sometimes,
right.
And I'm sympathetic towards this. It's kind of humiliating in a way. It's a very visible sign that your student is not paying attention to you, as opposed to if they're doodling, it may look like they're taking notes, or if they're daydreaming, at least maybe they look like they're thoughtful or something, So I think that, part of it is students or their teachers rather are no longer seeing their students on their cell phones. They're no longer experiencing that humiliation, that sort of etiquette breach. And they think it's great because it's not being rubbed in their face how boring they are all the time, basically. And that might be why I think teachers and administrators are seeing this as a positive. And I think if we think of this as like an etiquette thing, then maybe it's still okay, as long as we're not using suspensions, but, we're kind of saying like it's just good etiquette for students not to whip out their cell phone in class. I'm actually kind of sympathetic towards that. But as long as we understand that it doesn't seem to be having much impact on their grades or their mental health or their bullying with each other or that sort of thing, that's probably not the panacea for those outcomes.
Professor Chris Ferguson, professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, author of Catastrophe, The Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Decisions Worse. Professor Ferguson, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
It was a real pleasure. I always appreciate being on.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Your show keeps me alive during the week. There's nobody I'd rather listen to between 5 and 9 in the morning than you guys.
On AM 560, The Answer.
Good news for small businesses. The all-in IT package from Turnkey has been extended. That's right. Turnkey, the local leader in small business IT services, is extending their all-in package pricing through February.